I'm Tony Northrup, and Sony brought us to Montana to test out their new wildlife lens, the 600mm f4. Just kidding, that's the Statue of Liberty's butt. We're in Jersey. This is the $13,000 Sony 600mm f4. And before you freak out about it being super expensive, that's a pretty typical price for a lens like this. In fact, we own the Nikon one, as do a lot of serious wildlife photographers. And why would you spend that kind of money? Because wildlife photography takes months and years. And when that perfect moment finally happens and the eagle pulls the fish out of the water and the sun is rising and the light is just perfect, you want to make sure that you get every last detail and as many frames to choose from as possible. And that hasn't been something that you could do with the Sony up until now. Sure, you could adapt a lens from Canon maybe, but we all found that the autofocus performance just wasn't good enough. Not that you couldn't get a shot, but it wasn't great. So right now I'm shooting with the Sony A9 and a 2x teleconverter, putting me at 1200mm. The A9 at 1200mm is actually outperforming my Nikon D850 with the same configuration. At 1200mm, the D850 really lags and can be really frustrating and misses focus on a lot of shots. But the A9 is better. It's not perfect. Like, I finally found the point when the A9's autofocus starts to die a little bit. Nonetheless, it's still doing pretty well and I'm getting a lot of shots. So the conditions out here at Liberty Park in Jersey are not perfect. In fact, there's so much haze that the sky is downright cloudy, and the heat rising off the beach means that there are literally no sharp shots I'm gonna get of those oyster catchers. But the camera itself is performing really well. And when I zoom in, even though it's only 24 megapixels, I'm still getting a whole lot of detail. But the 24 megapixel problem is the biggest problem with the Sony system right now. If you want decent autofocus, you really have to be using the Sony A9, and it's 24 megapixels with an AA filter, and we would normally use the 45 megapixel D850. Now, Sony has the A7R III with 42 megapixels, but the autofocus we find to be insufficient with these big telephoto lenses. It's okay. You can get stuff in focus, but as far as tracking moving animals, I find it's not quite good enough.
With this lens, the A9 got 20 frames per second when tracking moving subjects, even in low light. The Canon 1DX and D5 each get about 10 to 11 sharp frames per second with their 600 f4s. That means with the Sony, you'll get almost twice as many frames to choose from.
If you have the latest Canon 600mm f4, the weight of the Sony is about the same. But we're shooting with the Nikon 600 f4, and the Nikon is actually much heavier, and that makes a big difference on long hikes like this, or anytime when you need to hand hold when you're shooting flying overhead birds, for example. The center of gravity of the lens is also much closer to the camera body, so the weight is closer to your body and it makes it feel like less than it actually is. There's really no surprises with the Sony 600mm f4 if you've used the Canon and Nikon versions. Like, the switches are in the same spot and they do the same thing. And even the case is basically exactly the same design. The Velcro strap is in exactly the same place, but that's okay because they're using a model that has worked for decades, and this one works too. As a sports lens, either you need a 600mm or you don't. And 600mm is too long for some sports, but we found it worked really well. The subject tracking with the A9 was better than any camera we've ever used, and so basically it's the best 600mm f4 sports experience that we've ever had. But for shooting soccer, that's kind of too far. I mean, we could really only shoot full body shots of people at the opposite goal. Nonetheless, it gave us an experience that I feel would carry over to things like motorsports, where you're more likely to use 600mm.
Compared to Sony's 200 to 600 zoom lens, this lens is a little sharper, even wide open. More importantly, the f4 aperture gathers more than twice as much light, meaning you get more background blur, more subject separation, and there's less than half the visible noise. Still, most people will be more than happy with the versatile 200 to 600 zoom. Okay, fellow sports and wildlife shooters, is it time to switch to Sony now that they finally have a 600 f4? There are lots of really compelling reasons to. We get actual in-focus 20 frames per second, and you cannot get that with a 1DX Mark II or a D5. And the focusing points go edge to edge, and it actually tracks at the corner of the frame. The subject tracking, following a moving subject around the frame, is better than even the Nikon D5 and the 3D focusing system. I was able to consistently and reliably and repeatedly track a very small bird flying very fast across a cluttered background, and I simply cannot do that with any other camera other than the A9. If you're shooting people, the eye autofocus really works. And even with the subject tracking, instead of locking onto the body, it'll find the face and lock onto that. and it works. Silent shooting is going to be a requirement if you're shooting something like golf, but for wildlife, it also meant that I didn't scare the animal off with my first loud shot like I would on a D5. So I got more shots in, and as a result, I got better shots. And with the A9 is only $3,500, and the lens itself at 13 grand is pretty typical. So it's a pretty good deal. But we ran into some serious problems that you need to be aware of before you go dropping 16K on it, right? First, there's limited weather sealing. If you ever get caught in the rain, that could wreck your camera. Now, we have been caught in the rain, and it's been okay, but you never know. Shutter lag is also a serious problem. Now we're talking about the A9 here. The A9 has a shutter lag of about 0.231 seconds as measured by Imaging Resource. The D5 is about half that, and the Canon 1DX Mark II is about a third of that. That means that it takes you about a quarter of a second from the time you push the shutter to it actually taking a picture. And shooting soccer especially, I found over and over again that the only way for me to get a shot was to find my subject and hold the shutter down before the ball arrived. If you're shooting sports with an A9 and you're standing next to a guy with a 1DX Mark II, he's gonna rattle off 2 frames before your camera takes its first frame. That means you might be missing the shot and you might not be making the money. That could be a real problem. DSLRs, of course, have an optical viewfinder. There is no lag. Everything happens instantly. The A9 does have some lag, and we've never complained about it in the past because it hasn't been so much of a problem, but tracking flying small birds at 1200 millimeters started to become a problem. This shows up because as I'm tracking a subject, I'll notice that I fall further and further behind the subject until the bird completely flies out of the frame. I've experienced this over and over again with slower mirrorless cameras, but it wasn't a problem with the A9. But I hadn't been shooting at 1200 millimeters before with the A9, and it seems to be real. Other people have measured the EVF lag of the A9 at around 30 milliseconds. That's 0.03 seconds. We tested it and validated it. That's about the number that we got. However, this lag increases when you start shooting. It about doubles. And if you're shooting and tracking a moving subject with continual autofocus, our testing found more than 1/10 of a second lag. That is about 2 frames at 20 frames per second. So as you're shooting, you're looking like 2 frames in the past. And I think that's what's causing us to fall further and further behind the subjects. And it meant for tracking fast moving subjects moving side to side like small birds, we'd get 15, 20 frames in focus, but by the time you get into second 2, 3, 4 of shooting and following that fast moving subject, you might have completely lost it in the frame, and you then have to take your face away from the camera, visually find it with your eyes, and reorient yourself. Maybe I'll get used to this with some more practice, or maybe this is kind of a deal breaker. I am hoping that the A9 Mark II will come out, and this is one of the things that Sony will focus on, making the whole thing faster and more like an optical viewfinder experience. I'll also say when we tested it for wildlife, we found the EVF resolution to be a problem. It's not a problem when you're shooting portraits, it's not a problem when you're shooting sports, but when you're shooting wildlife, you focus your attention on often a very small center part of the EVF. And if you're using an optical viewfinder, of course, you're seeing the real world with infinite resolution, and if you're using an EVF, well, the whole thing is only 3 megapixels. So if you're staring at 10% of the screen in the middle, it's pretty low resolution, and it works okay, but you can't necessarily tell that you've achieved autofocus, and it also takes away from part of the beauty of the experience, which is looking through the lens and seeing the animals up close. You just don't see the detail. Your pictures will be detailed, but you're not seeing it in real time. We also consistently have buffering and memory card issues. The A9 is, if you're writing to both cards, it's slowed down by the second card, which is not even UHS 2. So for sports, we pretty much have to shoot JPEG, and for wildlife, we still force ourselves to shoot RAW with a JPEG backup. But still, even though it has a 200 frame buffer, it does eventually catch up if you're in the heat of the action, because it's only 10 seconds of shooting, and it can take a long time to clear. You also cannot change certain menu items or start recording video while it's buffering. So sometimes I wanted to grab some stills and then quickly switch to video. Couldn't do it because you often have to wait 30 seconds for the buffer to clear before you can start doing those things. Both Chelsea and I separately with different memory cards had errors where the camera would refuse to shoot and it wanted to go through and like re-index the database of photos or something. I've never seen that on any other camera, and it made us miss more than a minute of shooting while it was doing that. And if the game-winning goal happens at that point, or the best wildlife moment ever happens at that point, you're going to be kicking yourself. So there's still a few kinks to work out with the Sony system. If you're interested in checking it out, you can get it from Lens Rentals at sdp.io/rent. That and the coupon code Northrup15 will get you 15% off. If you're interested in selling your gear and switching over to Sony, check out our partner KEH at sdp.io/KEH. Or if you just want to buy that 600mm, head to sdp.io/Sony600. If you have any follow-up questions, add a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you. And of course, don't forget to subscribe because we're going to be putting this up against the Nikon 600f4 and the Canon 600f4 in a real-world side-by-side shootout. Bye.